Friends, in 2 weeks, July 8th of 2017, will be our 8th birthday. And over those 8 years, you and I have driven some incredible cars. We've driven Aston Martins, McLarens, 911 Targas, we've driven rally cars, hell, I even piloted the Goodyear blimp. But in all that time, there is one car that I have never driven, and it also just happens to be the best-selling car in America for the last 15 years. So without further ado, we are going to drive a Toyota Camry, but not just any Toyota Camry, a Toyota Camry that I would argue looks a little bit like an Alfa Romeo Giulia. In this specific one, has a cool kind of paint job and has a V6 engine. But here's the thing that really stands out. It's not a brown or some sort of a blah interior, it's red. Red. So let's unpack bullets and numbers on output, but before we do that, we need to understand what's going on here. The deputy chief engineer of the Camry, his name is Tsuboi-san, had a good discussion with him about the 3 different powertrains on offer. And this is based on the Toyota new global architecture, TNGA. They all have to have some weirdo acronym, kind of like SPA over at Volvo. But this underpins the Prius, that CHR we just drove, and now the new Camry. So let's start with the most basic vanilla version, and that is the 4-cylinder, which is an all-new engine. So it's 2.5 liters, puts out 203 horsepower, or in the fancy XSE, which to you and I is the sport version, 206 horsepower. Both come in at 6,600 RPM, but the torque, more interesting to us, it's either 184 pound-feet or 186 in the sport model. Now you're probably asking yourself, well, what's the engine speed on that? Well, that comes in at 5,000 RPM. Forget about whether it's the 184 or 186, but how do they do it? Well, Tsuboi-san told me they changed the exhaust. It's a quad exhaust on a Camry, and basically that changes the back pressure, hence it's a little bit more power. Then speaking of power, there's this one. This is a 3.5 V6. Now this is not all new, but what's unique about this, it's really the only D-segment car left out there that has a V6 on offer. This one is 301 horsepower, also comes in at 6,600 RPM, 267 pound-feet of torque, comes in at a relatively aggressive 4,700 RPM. Now, in talking with Tsuboi-san, we had a good discussion about this because there is a hybrid version on offer. And so I asked him, is it very similar to, remember the RC and the RCF we drove way back in the day at Monticello Motor Club? That engine, that's from Yaguchi-san, that one works in both Atkinson as well as regular cycle in order to mimic the concept of cylinder deactivation. This doesn't necessarily need cylinder deactivation, but it borrows some of the technology from the hybrid. Now in the case of the hybrid, that puts out 176 horsepower, and then the torque on that's 163. But what's more interesting about the torque there, it comes in at a lower, it's kind of middle of the range, 3,200 RPM, stays flat all the way up to 5,200 RPM. Also switches between Atkinson and normal cycle. Now, depending on which engine, changes the transmission. So in a V6 or a 4-cylinder gas, anything you want as long as it's an 8-speed automatic, also all new, like the 2.54. But when you move to a hybrid, sadly, anything you want as long as it's a CVT. So that is, I believe, everything underneath the hood here. I feel we need to focus on some of the bigger changes, and that is driving dynamics. Now, before we press on to this segment, I need to pose a riddle here. And the riddle is this: what does the 2018 Camry have in common with old school Pontiacs? You think on that for a minute. Ready? If you were to say they are both lower, longer, and wider, you would be correct. Now, to unpack this, once again, we need to talk about our friend Tsuboi-san, the deputy chief engineer of the Camry. And he's been working on the Camry business for 10 years, has been at Toyota for 31 years, and 3 of those years he did at Ann Arbor. Anyway, do you remember Koba-san, who worked on the CHR? He was the deputy chief engineer of that car. Well, the two of them kind of collaborated here because they both have a double wishbone rear suspension. Now that kind of opens up the whole point here in that this is built on that new global architecture, which is really the mid-size architecture for Toyota. So it's kind of like the SPA architecture over at Volvo, but what they do is they apply it to a number of different more mass market cars. So that's why I find it interesting that they do a rather expensive solution of a double wishbone suspension in the rear as opposed to like they do the standard McPherson struts in the front. Now we're going to spend some time really focusing on this in the full first drive review, so make sure you come back for that. We're actually going to do two. We're going to do one on this car and one on the hybrid. Now let's put that aside. Let's talk about construction. Now, if you remember the Volvo we shot in Spain, we talked about the construction there, and it's not as exotic as that i8 we drove with the carbon fiber reinforced polymer, or the Aston Martin that had all sorts of like very exciting exotic materials. This, like the Volvo, is made out of like a menagerie of steels. So like, for example, in the front, it's regular old steel here, and based on where the impact needs to absorb energy, there's higher strength steel. But then we get to the passenger cell, and this is where they use ultra high strength steel. Now there are two reasons they do that. Obviously, it's to protect the passengers, but this is something I didn't cover in the Volvo episode, and the same thing applies to both vehicles. So an engineer like Tsuboi-san or Stefan over at Volvo, what they'll do with high strength steel is they can get the integrity, the structural integrity for intrusions, for accidents, but they can also make this steel thinner and still maintain the integrity, and the overall idea is to lower the weight of the vehicle. So for example, here is a D-segment car. So this is a large car that they've now made into 3,200 pounds. It's 3,241 pounds in the lowest, cheapest four-cylinder model. And then the most, like the heaviest hybrid version is about 3,560 pounds. So even with two propulsion systems. And that's a big function of changing the different types of construction material in the use of the Camry. Now, one more important point about the structure that goes back to the weight we talked about. If you look at all derivations, and there's a lot of different versions of the Camry. There's the four-cylinder in like a basic model, a fancy model, a middle-of-the-road model, and there's a hybrid and a basic fancy middle-of-the-road. But at the end of the day, all the gasoline models are a little bit heavier than the ones they replace. It's the hybrid models that actually went down in weight, and we talk about the reason why in the full first drive review for the hybrid, which will be coming out after the full first drive review of this one. Okay, now let's get to the point where I would argue are the biggest changes. Okay, so all kidding aside from the beginning of the episode, the thing that really is the headline between a 17 and an 18 Camry is design. And think of this as like an additional question. Do you like the design? Do you not like the design? Why or why not? Let me know in the comments below. But while you're stewing on that, for me, the thing that's the most successful about the design, and that's the change of the interior. Now, there's a couple of moving parts here. Number one, there is some corporate identity through here. Like, you look at the interior of a RAV4, a Highlander, or a Corolla, a lot of this dash top is the same. But then you look at some of the details, like for example, do you remember the episode with the BMW i3? The color and trim there, specifically the textures, there were too many textures going on there. Then we looked at the i8, that was just right, almost like Goldilocks. That one, it had, what, 4 different textures going on? This is even less. So there's one here, and one here, and then there's some trim pieces here. And you don't really see this kind of restraint in a car that comes from like an Asian design studio. Now, putting that aside, let's talk about the UX. The UX is something that I think this perplexes me, because in our world of today where you and I carry either an iOS device or an Android device, you would think every single car manufacturer, including one of the biggest in the world, would somehow co-opt that into their UX. Toyota, like, I take my hat off to them for fighting the good fight against like the big bad Google and the big bad Apple. But what they do is they've got their own walled garden called Entune. You have to put your own, like, their app on your own phone. It's not ideal. Now, I did speak with the Toyota marketing folks, and at this point they've gone from saying no to not yet. So let's watch this space. There may be changes coming down the pike. And there's one other thing I want to point out, find interesting beyond just the red seats here, and that is this is a Toyota Camry, so I wouldn't expect a totally kickin' stereo, but they've now offered, and not just in the fancy sporty model, but also in the hybrid, a 10.5-inch subwoofer that sits in the rear parcel shelf. That, am I the only one that finds that interesting? Anyway, let's go back outside. Now there's one more thing here. We talked about all different powertrains on offer, but one thing we didn't talk about is the details of an EV mode on the battery electric vehicle. Currently, there is no plug-in on offer. So there is an EV mode. It will work up to 75 miles an hour. And there's it's kind of like reading hieroglyphics. It depends on how much load is on the pedal and the speed, whether you're going up the hill. This is something we are going to unpack in the full first drive review of the hybrid. So to clarify, we're gonna have two full first drive reviews. We're gonna drive the V6, then we're gonna drive the hybrid. So it's gonna be in that order, so make sure you come back for that. So with that, I wanna restate this question about the design. And not just do you like it or do you not like it, but do you feel it is now more competitive against the Fusion, the Malibu, the Kia, the hybrid, or some other D-segment car I'm not discussing here? And tell me why or why not. Let me know in the comments below or via our social media, MotoManTV all one word, MotoManTV all one word, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And with that, I want to leave you with two things. Number one, please unsubscribe and then resubscribe, click notifications. This is how much YouTube has completely screwed up the platform. And number two, a fun fact, and this is a bit different than other fun facts. So when I come to events like this, the manufacturer, they come and they pick me up at the airport. And usually it's like an ex-cop and I get to sit with a guy, we talk about stories from the force, but this time they sent an 18-year-old. And we get in the car and he starts playing music, streamed from his phone. And it's like Frank Sinatra, Ella Fitzgerald. And if you know anything about Brazilian music, he starts playing Jobim. And I'm like, okay, something is very strange here. So I start talking to this guy. Turns out Pedro was born in Sao Paulo, Brazil. He moved to Portland I want to say 8 years ago with his mother. And he is now a musician, plays piano, he plays soccer professionally. And get this, his grandfather, 79, was a professional drummer. But not just a professional drummer, this guy used to be the drummer for Frank Sinatra. So this kid goes and visits his grandfather in Toronto, Canada. They jam in a room that is full of vinyls, like floor to ceiling of nothing but vinyls, and listens to stories how this guy used to go and pick up girls with Frank Sinatra. I'm doing something wrong in life. Until I see you next time, bish beta.